Hey, it's Owen from Happy, and today we're going to take a look at exciting new box from Chandler Limited, the RS660 Compressor. The RS660 is a very new tube-based mono compressor styled after both the Fairchild 660 and the EMI RS124 custom compressor. Most audio manipulators will be aware of the legendary, rare and pricey Fairchild 660, which sells for about 50 grand. And the RS124, which is a custom piece designed by EMI Studios after they decided to gut their Altec 436 compressor and rebuild it as a unit they deemed more useful for their own studio purposes. If you're watching this, I'm sure you're aware of the history, or at least the audio hardware of the Chandler company. But let's dive in for just a moment. Chandler Limited started out with founder Wade Gecky making his own DIY versions of vintage equipment from the EMI Abbey Road studios in the UK. And the company being so impressed with the sound, he began working in partnership with the studio to rebuild modern classics of some of their custom audio pieces. Of course, these aren't the only pieces Chandler makes, but let's focus on that one for today. Like all Chandler pieces, the RS660 is a hefty, well-built piece of kit, and sound-wise, it sounds fantastic. Put any audio through it, start to squish it, and it comes out thicker and richer than before it went in. It probably wouldn't be my first choice for super fast modern material, but anything that requires a vintage 60s vibe will definitely benefit from this piece, which uses the once rare but now back in production 6386 tube for its compression. Now, in comparison to the Fairchild 660, I've never actually had the chance to get my hands on a real one. If you've got one and want to send it in for review, I will happily do it though. But I've definitely used the Waves software version, and while it has its moments, it's never 100% satisfied me with what I think it should sound like. Whereas the RS660 does exactly what I've always imagined this box should sound like: thick and large. Today, we're going to record drums with a single overhead mic, some bass, and then I'll get Georgia in to play guitar over the top. Then I'm going to put the box through its paces and see what it can really do with these instruments, and then finally I'm going to run it over the whole mono mix to see what happens. For a mic today, I'll be using the brand new Pinnacle Fat Top 2 ribbon mic for some nice vintage sounds to complement the compressor. Now, the RS660 doesn't have a built-in bypass control, so I'll display on screen when I bypass the insert, but I'm sure you'll hear it happen anyway. Here we go. take a look at the knobs on this thing. It's a fairly simple box. I love that. We've got big input and output controls which do exactly what you'd expect. Push the input harder and get more compression, and use the output to control the level coming out the other end. Here, we've got a rotary selector for the THD, total harmonic distortion, limit, or compressor. THD turns the box into a distortion or an overdrive, ranging from light to heavy-ish. Limit is a nice thick coloured limiter which will give you an instantly recognisable classic tone, and compress is a more subtle, smoother and less aggressive version of the limiter, I guess more usable for everyday compression if you will. The time constant is an interesting setup from this thing. Directly inspired by the Fairchild 660 time switch with a taste of RS124 as well. The first three settings replicate the swifter settings of the Fairchild, or as fast as the Fairchild gets, with a quicker attack and release that gets a little lower as you move around the dial. Setting 4 is more moderate on the attack, allowing more transient through and gives a little less colour. And 5 through 7 replicate the settings of the EMI RS124, really quite gentle on the attack and overall very smooth tone and release. And finally, we've got a balance control over here for easy calibration with this pulse button here, and a link switch if you want to work with a stereo pair. And round the back, we've got an impedance switch, 600 ohms for modern studio use and 200 ohms, which is the original Abbey Road studio standard. And there we have it, the Chandler RS660 vari-mu compressor, a thick, harmonically rich piece. I mentioned earlier in the video that this thing sounded like how I wish plug-in versions of vari-mu compressors actually sounded. I don't think I've heard a plug-in that can really replicate what a good vari-mu compressor does, and I feel like the RS660 is a truly great piece for this kind of sound. It seems to make everything you run into it sound like a classic 60s record. It'll take the edge off drums and make them nice and creamy, and if you push it hard enough, it'll start to mess with your cymbals and reverbs in the gaps too. Perfect. On bass, I was surprised that at lower time constants, you'll get a really nice transient attack. And on guitar, it's just really nice and smooth. On an overall mix, I'm loving it for that mid-60s vintage style. A really rounded glue holding everything nicely together. Now, it's not a box for short, fast, snappy transients. This thing is all about thickness, harmonic detail, and vintage tone. And it does that so well. What we use today is a rear view unit, which I unfortunately have to send back. But it's got me seriously considering adding this kind of box into my mix chain. It's not a cheap compressor, but for a vari-mu unit, it's very reasonably priced, especially compared to other vintage units it's based on, or other pieces like the gate stay level or the original Altec 436 through to 438. The RS660 retails for around $6,300 Australian and is available now from all decent hardware retailers. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time for more stuff.